The animation begins by showing Norman and his grandmother watching a movie about a woman trying to save herself from a zombie attack. While watching, Norman's father, Perry, showed up and told Norman to take out the trash. After taking out the garbage, Norman told his father that his grandmother had asked him to turn up the heating because her feet were cold. Perry, fixing the lights in the other room, was shocked to hear Norman's words, as was Norman's mother, Sandra, and his older sister, Courtney. His grandmother had long passed away. His father scolded him because he always talked about strange things. Perry asked Norman to behave normally like other children. He didn't want Norman to behave strangely like his maternal great-uncle, Prendergast. Even though his father scolded him, his mother defended him and said that Norman was in the process of growing up. In the morning, Norman went to school and greeted everyone he met on the street. Some people who saw Norman's behavior just shook their heads while thinking that Norman was a strange boy talking to himself. In fact, Norman was greeting the spirits of people who had died who could not be seen by ordinary people. Soon after, Norman arrived at school. At the same time, he realized the presence of a middle-aged man quietly observing him from a distance. Norman was uncomfortable with the man's existence and rushed into the school building. Not only in his neighborhood, but Norman was also dubbed a freak in his school. Most of the students ostracized him because he always acted strangely. Not even a few of them often harassed Norman, both physically and mentally. When Norman was about to pick up his books in the locker, one of his schoolmates, Alvin, suddenly appeared and harassed him. All this time, Alvin always thought of Norman as a stupid boy because he used to talk to himself and claim that he could speak to the dead. Although Norman was often excluded by his other friends, one of his classmates, Neil, seemed sympathetic. Norman and his schoolmates were seen practicing acting for a theater performance in a wizard-themed school. Although the teacher looked very excited to explain everything they had to do to succeed in the show, the students could have been more enthusiastic. Instead, they got bored listening to their teacher's explanation. In the middle of their training, Norman suddenly had strange visions where their training grounds suddenly turned creepy, and his schoolmates turned into the figures of people he didn't know. However, the strange vision did not last long because his teacher immediately noticed Norman, who told him to focus while practicing. After school, Norman again got bullied by his schoolmates, who scribbled his locker with insulting words, but Norman chose to let it go. On the way home, Neil approached Norman, who invited him to make friends with him. Neil was also often bullied by their schoolmates because of his physical appearance. Neil knew that Norman was being bullied by Alvin and his schoolmates. He advised Norman not to think too much about them so that Norman could still be himself. Now that they were friends, Norman would not feel lonely anymore when the other ostracized him. Soon after, a middle-aged man who had previously observed him suddenly appeared before Norman and Neil. The man turned out to be Prendergast, Norman's maternal great-uncle. Prendergast deliberately went to Norman to tell him that the witch's curse was imminent and threatened everyone's safety. Only Norman had the power to stop the curse because he could see and communicate with the dead. Upon hearing that, Neil was also amazed at Norman and thought that the power possessed by Norman was quite remarkable. Neil then took Norman to his house, where he asked Norman to communicate with his dead dog. Arriving home, Neil asked his older brother, Mitch, to dig up his dog's grave. Mitch, who heard about it, immediately turned down a strange request from his younger brother. But Neil still didn't give up and took Norman to the yard to look for his dog's grave while asking Norman why the spirits wandered. Norman replied that the cause of the spirits wandering was the unfinished problems of their lives. They died suddenly or painfully. Neil told Norman that the dog was killed in a car crash while showing him where he buried his dog. Norman, who could see Neil's dog's spirit, then tells him that the dog is still around his house. Neil's dog's condition was pretty terrible. After Norman explained the condition of his dog at the time of his death, Neil became increasingly convinced that Norman could see spirits and communicate with the dead. Neil then taught Norman how to play with his late dog, but when Norman threw a branch, it hit the tree and bounced off Neil's head. Although Neil fell in the end, the two laughed and became closer. Meanwhile, Prendergast arrived at his house, where he rushed to find a book he would give to Norman. But unexpectedly, Prendergast suddenly had a heart attack and died before giving the book to Norman. Shortly afterward, Norman and his schoolmates performed a witch-themed theater performance in front of an audience. Everything was normal at first, but suddenly, Norman regained the vision he had seen during practice. Surprisingly, the vision moved Norman to another world. He was in a forest, where he was shocked by the appearance of some people on a witch hunt. When Norman was running away from them, suddenly, he was captured by a tree that told him the dead were coming. The frightened Norman screamed, shocking all the audience who watched the show, including Norman's parents. At the same time, Norman was aware that he was still on stage and at the center of attention because everyone thought Norman was strange. After the performance, Norman came home with his parents. He was scolded by his father in the car. Perry felt humiliated by Norman's peculiar behavior. He was forced to punish Norman by prohibiting him from talking about ghosts or things that didn't make sense. After Norman shouted in the middle of the show, the following morning, he got a new nickname from his friend, Abnorman. Since he couldn't stand being bullied by his schoolmates, Norman chose to calm himself down in the toilet. Unfortunately, Norman instead met his great-uncle, who was now a celestial spirit, whose appearance made him panic. Prendergast then told Norman that he became a celestial spirit because he still had unfinished business in the human world. He assigned Norman to read a book in the witch's grave before the sun went down or the zombies would rise from the dead. His great-uncle then forced him to promise to do the task. After Norman agreed to his request, Prendergast could go calmly to the afterlife. Returning from school, Norman was in his room and felt very agitated and scared. Soon, Neil came to his house, and Norman told him about his problem. Instead of offering help, Neil was frightened and said he couldn't help him. Norman eventually kicked him out of his house. After Neil left, Norman's grandmother, who saw his beloved grandson was having trouble, tried to cheer him up. She then told Norman that her reason for not being able to go to the afterlife was that she had sworn to look after him. Upon hearing that, Norman's courage returned, and he was determined to complete his mission. Norman rushed to Prendergast's house to look for the book his uncle meant. But the book was challenging to release from Prendergast's stiff hand. After that, Norman went to the old graveyard on the hill to read the book. Unfortunately, Norman, who had not finished reading the book, was bullied by Alvin, who followed him there. Not long after, the sun set and in the sky, there was a creepy witch cloud. At the same time, 7 bodies suddenly rose from their graves and went straight after Norman and Alvin. In the meantime, Neil, watching TV at his house, was suddenly approached by Courtney, looking for Norman. Neil then told her that Norman was in the old cemetery area. Courtney instantly freaked out because she was worried about Norman's safety. She asked Neil and Mitch to accompany her to find Norman. Meanwhile, Norman and Alvin managed to avoid the zombie chase. They then hid in Prendergast's house. Norman read various books to find a way to stop the undead. He finally learned that he had read a book in the wrong grave. Unfortunately, the undead managed to get into Prendergast's house and search for them. Norman and Alvin went into hiding, but it didn't take long for the undead to find out where they were, so Norman quickly pulled Alvin out of there. On the other hand, Mitch, Courtney, and Neil were heading to the cemetery in a car. But then, they crossed paths with Norman and Alvin, who were chased by the undead. Mitch, who was shocked to see the appearance of the two of them, immediately swerved and hit the undead. Mitch went down to see something he hit, but as soon as he realized that he had hit the undead, they all rushed into the car and ran away. However, they didn't know that one of the undead had managed to sneak into their car. Courtney then scolded Norman because she had to get involved with all those weird things because of him. Even so, Norman got the defense from Neil as the only person who believed in his power. At the same time, they were shocked by the appearance of the undead and a police car chasing them. In the panic, Norman calls one of his schoolmates, Salma, who knows about the witch's history. He asked Salma about the witch's grave's location, and she advised him to go to the old town hall where the witches used to stand trial on Main Street. Unexpectedly, the undead managed to get in the car and make a fuss until their car rolled off the highway. Luckily, they all survived, and Alvin, who managed to defeat the undead, felt happy. Mitch looked sad because his car had been destroyed. Meanwhile, a man buying drinks at a vending machine was approached by an undead swarm, which then startled the man, and he screamed in fear. The 6 undead had arrived in the city and seemed astonished at modern civilization because they were from the past. In the meantime, Norman and his comrades finally arrived at the town hall and went straight inside to look for clues about the location of the witch's grave stored among a pile of cluttered documents. Elsewhere, the undead chasing Norman were seen rescuing other undead being beaten by the townspeople. They all rushed away to the town hall. In the town hall library, Norman and the others kept figuring out where the witch was buried. However, after searching for a long time, they still couldn't find any clues, so Courtney and Mitch assumed that all they did was waste. Hearing this, Norman became irritated and thought that no one could understand him, so he drove them away. Meanwhile, the townspeople, who were afraid of the existence of the undead in their town, united their strengths, came to the town hall and burned the building down. When the riot broke out, Norman was approached by the undead. He rushed away to the roof of the building. Norman tried to tell the undead a story, but he was struck by lightning that made him enter another world. In the past, Norman saw a little girl named Agatha who was being tried by several people because she was caught doing magic. It was seen by 6 witnesses, and she was sentenced to death. Agatha defended herself by saying she was just playing, but her defense was ignored. They then tried to catch Agatha, who made her angry and cursed them all. After Norman regained consciousness, he finally found out that the 7 undead were the ones who tried Agatha. He told them that what they were doing was so evil that they knew that Agatha was just a little girl. They confessed and asked Norman to help them break Agatha's curse. Norman had the idea to stop the curse by speaking directly to Agatha's spirit. She became an evil spirit because of holding a grudge. But first, they had to get past the citizens who were already acting increasingly anarchic. Norman came out of the town hall along with the undead. The townspeople who saw them became even angrier because they thought that Norman had conspired with them. When he was about to be attacked by the townspeople, Courtney and the others stood with Norman to protect him. Courtney, angry because the townspeople were trying to kill his brother, then asked them to stop. Norman explained that he was only trying to help break Agatha's curse on the undead and did not intend to harm the people. They did not have to hurt them just because they were afraid. Hearing that, all the citizens came to their senses and dropped all their weapons. Then a little girl came forward and returned one of the undead hands. Soon, Agatha's angry spirit appeared, so Norman had to hurry to stop the curse. He asked his father to help deliver him to Agatha's grave and the undead who had found out his location. They got to the sentient woods that kept them all apart. Norman asked everyone to stay calm. Afterward, Norman walked toward Agatha's spirit and tried to talk to her. But unfortunately, Agatha did not want to talk to Norman. The angry Agatha attacked him and tried to kick him out, but Norman refused to give up. He then told the story of a boy different from other children. Norman said the boy could see and do things no one could understand. For that reason, the boy became lonely because he had no friends. Norman then noted that the longer Agatha was here, the more she would lose her identity because she wanted revenge even though she had died for 3 years. Norman tried to convince Agatha that what she did to the undead was equally cruel. He asked Agatha to stop and remind her that people always loved her. Norman then grabbed Agatha's hand and told her to remember the memories that made her happy. He was brought into Agatha's memory. She showed a place where her mother used to read books to her. But her happiness had been taken away by the people. Norman convinced Agatha she was not a witch. She is just a gifted little girl. Although some people want to hurt her just because she is different from others, she must feel sure there are still good people who will always love her. After listening to Norman's words, Agatha's spirit calmed down and fell asleep. After that, Agatha's spirit was finally able to go peacefully to the afterlife, along with the curse on the undead, who also began to disappear, and they could go quietly following Agatha. After the incident, Norman was warmly welcomed by his family, who have now decided to accept Norman as he is. With his power, Norman could save everyone. He was immediately hugged by his mother, who was happy because Norman was fine. The last scene shows Norman returning to watch zombie movies with his grandmother. His father, knowing that Norman's grandmother was there, greeted her.